My name is Maren and I work as a financial analyst in Denver. While I was drowning out the sting of being left off my sister-in-law's wedding guest list, my bank called with a warning. My credit card was being charged again and again at that very reception. The hotel, the flowers, the jewelry, the catering, all billed under my name. I had not been invited to a single toast. Yet somehow my money had a seat at every table. Someone in my husband's family had quietly turned me into the one footing the bill, and I was about to find out who. Before I tell you how this ends, if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, and the moment someone finally stops staying quiet, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I had built my life carefully. I paid my bills on time, kept a separate account for anything unpredictable, and had a second credit card set aside for shared family expenses, things like a birthday dinner or a bag of groceries when we hosted. That card mattered less to me than my main accounts. The charges on it were always small, so I let its statements pile up in an email folder I rarely opened. It felt harmless at the time. Everett was the reason I kept showing up to those dinners even when they left a bitter taste in my mouth. His parents Byron and Lynette had a way of being warm to him and cool to me in the same breath. When Everett was in the room, Lynette asked about my work with interest that sounded genuine. The moment he stepped out, her voice flattened, and the questions stopped. Byron rarely spoke to me directly at all, unless it was to mention that money was tight again that month. Coralie was the center of that house in a way I never was, even after years of showing up and remembering birthdays. Everett's younger sister could miss a payment or crash a car, and somehow the story rearranged itself around her by dinner. She became the victim of bad luck rather than bad decisions. I had started to notice that this protection never extended to me. It was during one of those Sunday dinners that the first thread of this story got pulled, though I did not recognize it at the time. Lynette mentioned she needed to put down a deposit for something for Coralie, some detail she brushed past too quickly for me to catch. She asked to borrow my card for a moment, promising to pay me back that week. I handed it over without hesitation because 4 years of trying to be the easy daughter-in-law had trained me to stop asking follow-up questions. What I did not know then was that Lynette wrote down every number on that card before handing it back, the 16 digits, the expiration date, even the 3 digits on the back meant to prove a charge came from the real cardholder. She told herself she was being efficient, saving herself the trouble of asking again. I told myself nothing because I did not know there would be a next time. The weeks that followed felt different in a way I could not quite name. Calls from Lynette became shorter and distracted. A family dinner got canceled the morning it was supposed to happen. Coralie stopped responding to my texts altogether. Even Everett noticed his mother changing the subject whenever he asked about wedding planning, as if there was nothing yet worth discussing. I did not think much of any single moment until I stopped by his parents' house one afternoon to grab a jacket he had left behind. Byron let me in without much conversation. On the counter beside a stack of unopened mail sat a folder, and on top of it was an invoice from one of the most expensive event venues in the city. Coralie's name was printed at the top beside a wedding date only days away and a deposit figure large enough that I read it twice. When I found Lynette that evening, I did not accuse her of anything. I simply asked why no one had mentioned Coralie's wedding. She did not flinch. She told me in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather that they wanted the ceremony to include only the people who truly belonged to the family. I stood there with my jacket in my hands, waiting for her to soften the sentence. She never did. That single sentence rearranged 4 years of memory for me at once. Every dinner, every hospital visit for Byron's surgery, I had rearranged my schedule for every comment I had let slide. All of it collapsed under the weight of one honest admission. I was useful, dependable, and convenient, but I was not someone they wanted standing in the room when Coralie said her vows. I told Everett what his mother had said. He was furious, though. His anger came tangled with disbelief, as if part of him still hoped for an explanation that made sense. He called his parents that night and again the next morning, but they gave him nothing beyond vague reassurances that timing had gotten away from them. I made a decision that felt at the time like the only dignified option left to me. I was not going to beg my way into a wedding that had already decided I was not worth inviting. On the day of the wedding, Everett went because Coralie was still his sister, and he told me gently that he needed to be there for that reason alone, regardless of how his parents had treated me. I told him I understood, and I meant it. I stayed home, then decided a few hours at the office would be a better use of my time than sitting alone with my thoughts, so I drove in as the afternoon light was already starting to fade. The office was nearly empty by the time I got there, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. I was halfway through a spreadsheet when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and something in the automated greeting made my stomach tighten before a real person even got on the line. The woman from the bank's fraud department read off several charges made that afternoon: a luxury hotel, a florist known for elaborate arrangements, a jewelry boutique, a catering company, an event venue whose name I recognized instantly because I had seen it printed on that invoice weeks earlier. The total came to nearly $28,000 charged across the past several weeks, sitting quietly in the one account I almost never checked. For a moment I could not speak because two separate parts of my life were colliding in the worst possible way. The wedding I had not been invited to was happening at that exact moment, and my money apparently had been invited after all. I thought about Lynette borrowing my card months earlier, the casual promise to pay me back the numbers I never thought to protect afterward. It was not proof yet, but it was enough to make my hands go cold. She asked me the only question that mattered. Had I authorized these transactions? I understood that whatever I said next would ripple outward in ways I could not fully predict. If I said yes, I would be signing my name to a lie and quietly accepting a debt that was never mine, protecting people who had made it clear I was not worth protecting in return. If I said no, a room full of flowers and rented china might come to a very public, very expensive stop. I told her no. I told her as steadily as I could manage that I had not approved a single one of those charges and that I wanted them investigated as fraud. She thanked me for my honesty and explained my card would be frozen immediately. I hung up the phone in an empty office alone with the strange, hollow feeling of having just done something enormous without anyone else in the world knowing it yet. Everett called me less than an hour later, his voice low and urgent in a way I had never heard from him before. He was standing outside the reception hall away from the noise, telling me that payment terminals had started failing one after another, that the coordinator had pulled his parents aside twice already, and that he had watched the color drain from his mother's face when someone mentioned the name on the account. He told me the catering staff had stopped plating the next course. The florist's assistant had cornered Byron near the gift table asking about a backup card for the centerpieces. Coralie had disappeared into a side room in tears, and Byron was pacing near the entrance, phone pressed to his ear, trying to reach someone who could make the problem disappear before the guests noticed. I told Everett the truth, that I had confirmed the charges as fraud less than an hour earlier, sitting alone at my desk. There was a long silence on his end, not from anger at me, but from the weight of understanding exactly what that meant for the people still standing in that room. He said he needed to stay a little longer, if only to see how his family handled the collapse they had built for themselves. By the time he got home that night, his face was pale in a way I had rarely seen. He described vendors quietly pulling his parents aside, the murmurs starting among guests who noticed food had stopped coming out, and Coralie eventually stepping back into the room with a forced smile that did not reach her eyes. No one had said my name out loud, he told me, but everyone in that family clearly already understood exactly whose card had just stopped working. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, turning over a memory that had been sitting dormant for months. I thought back to that ordinary Sunday dinner when Lynette asked to borrow my card, promising to pay me back within the week. I remembered handing it over without hesitation, the way I always did, because refusing small requests from Everett's family had never felt worth the tension it would create. I did not have proof yet, not the kind a bank would accept, but the shape of the truth had already settled in my mind. Lynette had not simply borrowed convenience from me that evening. She had taken something permanent, something she could return to whenever the family needed money and did not want to ask twice. The next morning my phone rang before 8 o'clock, and Byron's voice came through loud enough that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. He accused me of deliberately sabotaging his daughter's wedding, of humiliating the family in front of people who had traveled from out of state. I let him finish, mostly because interrupting him had never once changed the outcome of a conversation in this family. When I finally spoke, I asked him plainly whether he was denying that my card information had been used without my knowledge. He did not answer that question directly, which told me more than any answer could have. Instead, he shifted into talk of family loyalty, of how calling the bank instead of calling him first had turned a private matter into something humiliating in public. He never once said the word sorry. Lynette called an hour later, her tone softer but no less unsettling in what it revealed. She reminded me that Everett and I were comfortable, and that helping cover part of Coralie's wedding should not have felt like such a burden. When I asked if she had used my card information without asking me first, she said it plainly, almost proudly, telling me I had handed her the card myself months earlier, so she had simply used what she already had. Hearing her say it so calmly was somehow worse than a denial would have been. To Lynette, my card had stopped being mine the moment I let her borrow it once. My consent for that single transaction had transformed in her mind into permission for every transaction that followed. She spoke as though efficiency excused everything, as though having money made it reasonable to spend it without asking. Coralie's call came that afternoon, and it was nothing like her mother's calm justification. She told me I had always been jealous of her relationship with Everett's parents, that I could not stand watching her be loved the way I apparently never had been, and that I had chosen her wedding day to make everyone suffer by it. I listened without responding, understanding, even as she said it, that she needed this version of events to be true. After I hung up, I realized the real wound had very little to do with the $28,000 sitting frozen in a fraud investigation. The money was simply proof of something I had suspected for years but never let myself say out loud. This family had never seen me as someone who belonged among them. They had seen a convenient account, welcome to contribute but never quite welcome to attend. Over the following days, I worked closely with the bank's fraud team and the investigator assigned to the case, providing months of bank statements, my work calendar, and badge access records confirming I had not set foot near any of the disputed locations. The vendors, once they understood the seriousness of the situation, became far more cooperative than Byron or Lynette had anticipated. The venue turned over contracts and signed forms. The jeweler produced records of a phone call in which someone had read out my card number, expiration date, and security code without needing to explain who they were. The florist's office provided a recorded booking call from weeks earlier, capturing the deposit conversation in far more detail than anyone in that family probably expected. The recording left almost nothing open to interpretation. It was Lynette's voice, calm and businesslike, reciting my card information as though she had every right to do so, followed by Byron's voice a few minutes later, reassuring the coordinator that he would personally guarantee payment if anything came up. Hearing them speak so easily about money that was never theirs made something in my chest tighten in a way I had not expected. Everett listened to a portion of that recording sitting beside me, and I watched something change behind his eyes as the truth stopped being an abstraction and became an actual voice, his mother's voice, reciting numbers that belonged to his wife. He had spent days trying to find an explanation that did not require seeing his parents as people capable of this. That recording took that possibility away from him entirely. He called his parents that evening, and I heard the conversation shift the moment they realized what he now knew. Byron insisted this was a private matter that never needed to reach outsiders. Lynette's tone grew sharper, as though Everett's questions were a betrayal rather than a reasonable response to hearing his mother's voice reading his wife's information aloud to a stranger. By the end of that call, he was no longer trying to find a version of events that let his family remain blameless. The days that followed brought a different kind of pressure, one that came from the quiet network of relatives who had known the Sloans far longer than I had been part of this family. I first noticed it when a cousin I had met only a handful of times sent me a message asking why I felt the need to embarrass everyone over what she called a simple misunderstanding. I read it twice before I understood that a different version of events had already begun circulating without me. Lynette had spent those days making phone calls of her own aimed at a much wider audience than the bank or the investigator. She told aunts, uncles, and old family friends a story carefully edited to leave out everything that made her look responsible. In her version, I was a bitter daughter-in-law who had never gotten over being excluded, using a minor billing mix-up as an excuse to humiliate the family out of spite. It worked better than I expected. Within a week, people who barely knew me were repeating this story as fact. A distant aunt posted about loyalty and family mattering more than money without naming me directly but leaving little doubt who she meant. A family friend messaged Everett, suggesting his wife needed to learn to let small things go for the sake of peace. None of these people had asked me a single question. I remember scrolling through a group text one evening, watching people I had shared holidays with for years discuss what should be done about me as though I were a problem the family needed to manage, rather than a person who had been robbed. Something cracked in me that night, not from anger but from a colder, more exhausting kind of grief. For years I had told myself that if I stayed patient and useful, I would eventually earn a real place in this family. Watching strangers repeat Lynette's version of events without hesitation made it impossible to keep believing that. They never considered I might be telling the truth because in their eyes I had never been anything more than the outsider who married into money and finally had to start paying for it. That was the lowest point of this entire ordeal, lower even than the moment the bank first called with the total of those charges. Being stolen from had hurt in a sharp, immediate way. Being quietly rewritten into the villain of my own story cut somewhere slower and deeper. I had spent 4 years trying to prove I belonged, and none of it mattered the moment I stopped being convenient. I told Everett late one night when neither of us could sleep that I finally understood something I had been avoiding for years. I had been so focused on earning acceptance from his parents that I never let myself see how little acceptance they had ever actually offered. Every dinner and every favor had been an investment in a relationship that was never going to pay out because the foundation itself had never been real. Everett did not try to argue me out of that feeling. He sat with me in the weight of what his family had done, occasionally reaching over to hold my hand, letting it settle fully between us. I think that night was the first time I truly grieved, not the money, not even the wedding, but the years of hope I had poured into something that had never once been mutual. It took nearly 2 months for the investigation to move from something whispered about in family group chats to something that could no longer be argued away. The recorded calls, the vendor statements, and the documentation proving my whereabouts during every disputed charge had all been reviewed until there was almost nothing left to interpret differently. Byron and Lynette were now facing the real possibility of being held financially and legally responsible for using my identity without consent. Word of how serious things had become traveled quickly through the family. Within days, the tone of every message I received shifted. The relatives who had lectured me about loyalty weeks earlier suddenly grew quiet, their confidence replaced by an awkward silence that told me they had started hearing a different version of events, one that no longer required taking Lynette's word for anything. I did not reach out to correct anyone. I let the silence stretch. Everett told me his parents wanted to come by the house along with Coralie, though he warned me not to expect an apology shaped the way I might have hoped for years earlier. I agreed to let them come, no longer needing to avoid a confrontation I had spent so long trying not to cause. They arrived on a Sunday evening, standing awkwardly in my living room, in a way that felt unfamiliar given how comfortable Byron and Lynette had always seemed in spaces they assumed belonged to them by default. This was not a visit born from reflection. It was a visit born from consequence, from legal bills that had grown larger than anyone anticipated, from a reputation cracking in front of people who once respected them, and from Coralie's marriage already straining under financial stress. Byron spoke first, his voice carrying the same controlled anger from that first phone call, now layered with something closer to desperation. He asked me to consider withdrawing my statement, to tell the investigator this had all been a family misunderstanding rather than a deliberate misuse of my information. He framed it as mercy, something I owed the family, as though years of quiet exclusion constituted a debt on my part rather than his. Lynette's approach was softer, but no less calculated, reminding me gently that whatever had happened, we were still family, that surely there was room for forgiveness between people who had shared years of holidays. Coralie sat on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped around herself, adding little beyond quiet crying, and the plea that I was destroying her marriage before it had even had a real chance to begin. When they finished, I asked them a single question that had been sitting in my chest for months. I asked whether at any point while planning that wedding any one of them had considered inviting me. Not defended, not explained, simply considered it even for a moment. No one answered right away, and the silence that followed became its own kind of confession, more honest than anything any of them had said since this began. I told them the silence was the only answer I had ever needed. They wanted my money without wanting my presence, my reliability without my belonging, my card number without my name on the guest list. I told them forgiveness and taking responsibility on someone else's behalf were two entirely different things, and I was no longer willing to blur that line to make life more comfortable for people who had never extended that comfort to me. When Lynette called this a mistake, rather than a choice, I finally said what I had been holding back. A mistake happens once by accident and gets corrected the moment someone realizes what occurred. What she had done was neither an accident nor a single moment. It was a pattern repeated deliberately across weeks, defended the instant I discovered it, and justified afterward with the casual explanation that I could clearly afford it. Everett stood beside me, closer than he had stood in any previous conversation with his parents. When Byron turned to him expecting one final appeal to loyalty, Everett simply shook his head and told his father that the truth mattered more to him than comfort, even when the truth implicated the people who raised him. I watched something in Byron's face fall, not from the financial consequences ahead, but from the quiet recognition that his own son had chosen honesty over blind loyalty. And nothing was going to change that. They left without the apology I once might have hoped for, and without the agreement they had clearly hoped to secure. In the weeks that followed, the investigation reached its formal conclusion, confirming everything the evidence had already made clear. Byron and Lynette were held accountable for the unauthorized use of my financial information, and the disputed charges were fully reversed, restoring both the money and my credit standing to where they had been before any of this began. Coralie's marriage, built on debt she had not been honest about, began showing cracks almost immediately once the truth became known within the family. Byron and Lynette lost something less tangible but more permanent, the quiet trust of relatives who had once taken their word without question and now understood exactly how easily that word could be shaped to serve their own comfort. As for me, I stopped waiting for this family to offer me the acceptance I had spent years trying to earn. I put that same energy into my work, my home, and the marriage I actually wanted to protect, the one with Everett, who had chosen honesty over the easier path of looking away. I stopped measuring my worth by how included I felt at someone else's table and started measuring it by whether the people around me treated me with basic honesty, which had turned out to be far rarer in that family than I once assumed. I think about that wedding sometimes not with bitterness anymore, but with a strange kind of clarity. They never wanted me standing in that room celebrating a moment they had decided I was not worthy enough to witness. Yet somehow they wanted my name attached to every cost required to make that moment happen. In the end, it was not a stolen number on a card that ended things between us. It was the undeniable proof of exactly how little I had ever meant to people I had spent years trying to belong to, and the steady decision to finally stop trying. If this story hit close to home, or if you've ever had to learn the hard way who actually shows up for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed because there's a lot more still to come. Take care of yourselves, and don't let anyone convince you that being useful is the same thing as being loved.